When people from North Carolina first started settling the land that would become Tennessee, they brought with them all the differences and divisions that existed back home. North Carolina wasn't one single, united community back then. It was a patchwork of cultures, each proud, independent, and slow to mix. There were the Highland Scots, who had brought their clans and traditions straight from the misty hills of Scotland. The Scotch-Irish, tough mountain people with a fierce love of freedom. The peaceful Quakers, who believed in non-violence and simple living. And the Dutch, steady farmers known for their order and skill. For many years, these groups lived side by side but rarely blended together. They spoke differently, worshipped differently, and held fast to their old customs. Even long after Tennessee began to be settled, these distinctions remained strong. In fact, they still lingered for generations, unlike in many other states, where people's backgrounds eventually blended into a single culture. There were reasons for that. North Carolina's geography kept its people apart. Though it had a long coastline, the harbors were poor. Shifting sandbars blocked the mouths of its rivers, making it difficult and dangerous for large ships to approach. That meant there were few seaports and little trade with the outside world. Until the first railroads were built, farmers had to haul their crops hundreds of miles by wagon south to Charleston, or north to Petersburg and Richmond to sell their goods and buy supplies. A trip like that could take weeks, so most people stayed home, living off what they grew and made for themselves. Because of this isolation, North Carolinians learned to be self-reliant and content with a simple life. They saw less of the world than people in other colonies, and that made them slower to change. Their speech, manners, and traditions held steady long after other regions had begun to modernize. Outsiders sometimes called them quiet or reserved, but they were steady, dependable people, with a deep sense of loyalty to their homes and families. Whigs and Tories. Now, young readers, you've probably heard the words Whig and Tory. During the Revolutionary War, a Whig was someone who supported American independence. A Tory was someone who remained loyal to the British king. The war began in 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington, Massachusetts. A year later, on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress declared the 13 American colonies free and independent. That's why we still celebrate the 4th of July today. The war dragged on for 8 long years. When it finally ended, Great Britain gave up its claim to America, and the new United States was born. But North Carolina's experience in that war was different and often painful. The people were divided almost evenly between Whigs and Tories, and they fought each other as bitterly as they fought the British. Neighbors burned each other's homes, stole livestock, and took revenge whenever they could. It was, in many places, a civil war within the Revolution. The Highland Scots, especially those living in the Sandhills region, were almost all Tories. It wasn't that they were bad people, they simply believed what they had been taught back in Scotland, that the king ruled by divine right and it was a sin to resist him. Many of them couldn't even read, and so they accepted the word of their ministers without question. Others had become Tories for a different reason. Years earlier, they had joined the regulation movement, a protest against unfair taxes and corrupt officials. When the British crushed that uprising, those men were forced to swear loyalty to the crown. Later, when the revolution came, they took that oath seriously and refused to break it. To them, keeping their word was a matter of conscience. Then there were the Quakers, peaceful people who refused to fight at all. To them, war was against the teachings of Christ. They would neither bear arms for the king nor for the colonies. Because of this, both sides mistrusted them. They were robbed, harassed, and sometimes beaten, yet they never fought back. Instead, they endured their suffering quietly, holding to their belief in peace and forgiveness. For their honesty and gentle ways, Quakers were respected in time, even by those who disagreed with them. In Tennessee, they were later exempted from militia service in peacetime, a small gesture of gratitude for their peaceful spirit. Of course, that exemption didn't extend to wartime, when every able man was needed to defend his home. Who was right? Looking back, it is easy to say the Whigs were heroes and the Tories were traitors, but history is rarely that simple. Not all Tories were wicked or cowardly. Some truly believed they were doing right by remaining loyal to their king or honoring their oaths. Others, however, chose sides for selfish reasons. They thought Britain would win the war and wanted to stay on the strong side. When the colonies gained independence, many of these opportunists fled, leaving the new nation to the people who had sacrificed for it. From this turbulent mix of cultures and convictions, Scots and Scotch-Irish, Quakers and English, Whigs and Tories, the settlers of Tennessee would soon emerge. They carried with them courage, independence, faith, and the hard lessons learned in North Carolina's struggle. And on the far side of the mountains, in the wild lands beyond the Alleghenies, they would begin building something entirely new. Now, we dive deeper into the arrival of European settlers and the birth of a new frontier society in East Tennessee. It's a story of courage, conflict, and the relentless drive to carve home out of the rugged Appalachian Mountains. The story of settlement in East Tennessee really kicks off after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. The British victory opened up vast territories, but it also came with a major complication, the Proclamation of 1763. This royal decree drew a line along the crest of the Appalachians and forbade colonial settlement west of it. The idea was to prevent conflict with Native American tribes and keep the colonies manageable. But for the land-hungry, adventurous souls back east, that line was less of a barrier and more of a challenge. Who were these first pioneers? They were a tough, independent bunch, mostly of Scots-Irish, English, and German descent. They were farmers, hunters, and traders, often called long hunters for their extended hunting trips deep into the wilderness. They were drawn by the promise of fertile land, abundant game, and the freedom to live life on their own terms, far from the reach of colonial governments and tax collectors. One of the most legendary of these early figures was Daniel Boone. While he's more famously associated with Kentucky, Boone's trailblazing was crucial for Tennessee as well. In the 1760s, he blazed trails through the Cumberland Gap, a natural passage through the mountains, opening a gateway for thousands of settlers to pour into the valleys of the Holston, Watauga, and Nolichucky rivers. These early journeys were incredibly dangerous, filled with unknown terrain, harsh weather, and the constant threat of encounters with those who already called this land home. The first permanent European settlement in what would become Tennessee was established around 1769, near the Watauga River. This wasn't a government-sanctioned colony. In fact, it was technically illegal according to the proclamation line. These settlers were squatters living on land they didn't legally own. Realizing they were outside the jurisdiction of both Virginia and North Carolina, they did something remarkable. In 1772, they formed the Watauga Association. Think about that for a moment. They were completely on their own, so they created their own government. They drafted one of the first written constitutions west of the Appalachians, establishing a court and a system for recording deeds and resolving disputes. It was a raw, practical form of democracy born out of necessity on the frontier. They even negotiated directly with the Cherokee to lease the land they were living on, showing a level of diplomacy that was often lacking in settler-native relations. A leading figure in this was James Robertson, a calm and steady leader who became known as the father of Middle Tennessee, but got his start right here in the East. Another key figure from this era was John Sevier. A charismatic and dashing Virginian, Sevier arrived in the Watauga settlements in 1773. He quickly became a military leader and a political force. His knack for leadership and his prowess as an Indian fighter made him a frontier hero. Sevier and Robertson would become the two towering figures in early Tennessee history, their destinies intertwined with the fate of the new settlements. Life on the Tennessee frontier was anything but easy. The settlers lived in simple log cabins, often with dirt floors and no windows, just openings covered with animal skins. They had to clear dense forests by hand to plant crops like corn, beans, and squash. Everything they needed, they had to make themselves, from their clothes spun from flax or wool to their tools forged in a blacksmith's fire. It was a life of constant, backbreaking labor. Women played an absolutely vital role in this society. They were not just homemakers, they were partners in survival. They managed the household, raised children, tended gardens, preserved food, spun cloth, and made clothing. They also had to be ready to defend the homestead when the men were away hunting or fighting. Figures like in Robertson, James Robertson's wife, were known for their resilience and courage in the face of incredible hardship. Of course, the settlers were not entering an empty land. They were moving into the ancestral hunting grounds of the Cherokee and other tribes. While some early interactions, like the Watauga land lease, were peaceful, the increasing number of settlers inevitably led to friction and conflict. As more land was cleared and more game was hunted, tensions escalated. The American Revolution would soon pour gasoline on this already smoldering fire. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1776, the Tennessee frontier became a battleground on two fronts. The settlers, who overwhelmingly supported the Patriot cause, had to fight not only the British, but also their Native American allies, particularly a faction of the Cherokee led by the warrior Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe had opposed the land sales from the start, famously warning that the settlers were purchasing a dark and bloody ground. He and his followers, known as the Chickamauga Cherokee, waged a fierce guerrilla war against the settlements for nearly 2 decades. This led to the construction of forts, or stations, all across the region. These weren't massive military fortresses, but rather collections of cabins connected by a high wooden stockade. Places like Fort Watauga and Eaton Station became crucial refuges for settlers during raids. When word of an impending attack came, families would grab what they could and race for the safety of the fort's walls. The stories from this period are filled with harrowing tales of sieges, ambushes, and daring rescues. Perhaps the most famous contribution of these Tennessee frontiersmen to the Revolution was the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780. The British commander, Major Patrick Ferguson, had threatened to march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. That was a mistake. Infuriated, John Sevier and Isaac Shelby rallied a volunteer militia of about 1,000 frontiersmen, who became known as the Over-Mountain Men. Carrying their own long rifles and provisions, they marched over the snowy Roan Mountains, a feat of endurance in itself. They surprised Ferguson's loyalist force at Kings Mountain just across the border in South Carolina. Using their expert marksmanship and frontier fighting tactics, they swarmed up the wooded slopes of the mountain. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. In just over an hour, the Over-Mountain Men killed or captured Ferguson's entire force. It was a stunning victory for the Patriots and a major turning point in the war's Southern campaign. Thomas Jefferson himself called it the turn of the tide of success. After the Revolution, the westward push intensified. The state of North Carolina, which still claimed the territory, opened a land office to sell off Tennessee land to pay its war debts. This triggered a massive new wave of migration and rampant land speculation. The fragile peace with the Native American tribes was shattered as settlers pushed even deeper into their territory. In a strange and fascinating twist of history, the settlers, feeling neglected and unprotected by North Carolina, decided once again to form their own government. In 1784, they declared themselves the independent state of Franklin, with John Sevier as their governor. For 4 years, this unrecognized state operated in a chaotic limbo, with 2 competing sets of laws and officials, one from Franklin and one from North Carolina. It was a bold, if ultimately failed, experiment in self-governance that showed the fiercely independent spirit of the Tennessee pioneers. By 1790, North Carolina finally ceded its western lands to the federal government, creating the territory south of the River Ohio. And just 6 years later, in 1796, Tennessee had enough population to be admitted to the Union as the 16th state. The wild frontier was becoming a structured society. The log cabins and forts were giving way to towns, courthouses, and churches. The settlement of East Tennessee was a complex and often brutal process. It was a story of incredible endurance and bravery, but also one of displacement and violence. The pioneers who crossed the Appalachians were dreamers and adventurers, who built a new world with their own hands. But their dream came at a great cost to the people who were there before them. This legacy, with all its triumphs and tragedies, is woven into the very fabric of Tennessee. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the settling of East Tennessee. Next time, we'll push further west and explore the founding of Nashville and the challenges of settling the Cumberland Basin. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Wild Tennessee.